Welcome. My name's Anna Ramich. I am the Chief of Staff and Vice President of the American Academy in Berlin. Thank you very, very much for joining us this evening. I have the great pleasure of welcoming all of you to our James N. Mattis lecture with Colin Kahl, entitled U.S. Defense Strategy in an Era of Major Power Competition. Colin will discuss the military and security implications of China's growing assertiveness, Russia's aggression in Ukraine, and the changing patterns of global alignment. And I'm quite sure that some of the other very current topics will come up, such as the situation in Israel, perhaps Armenia, and a few other places. As I just said, Colin is the fall 2023 James Mattis Distinguished Visitor. The General James N. Mattis Distinguished Visitorship, I can only say that so many times in a row, was established as an enduring testament to General Mattis's achievements. James Mattis has been recognized as the preeminent American military leader of our era. A four-star general, head of the U.S. military's Central Command and Joint Forces Command, as well as the 26th U.S. Secretary of Defense. Mattis is celebrated for his vision, integrity, and unwavering principles. His insistence on the centrality of democratic institutions, as well as his support for NATO and emphasis on the value of all of United States alliances, has made him a beacon in a time marked by populism and short-sighted criticism of long-time allies. The Mattis visitorship is meant to advance the bilateral conversation in an atmosphere of frank and civil exchange, with the goals of increasing the clarity of understanding between the U.S. and Germany, and strengthening connections between the two nations. With it, the Academy seeks to bring outstanding U.S. individuals in the fields of politics, diplomacy, security, and the international relations to Berlin each year. This past spring, we had Jeffrey Feltman here with us, and now this semester we have Colin, so I think we are off to a good start and making quite good on that promise. We're particularly thankful to General Dynamics, RTX, and Eric and Wendy Schmidt, whose generous support makes this visitorship possible. Now let me turn to our guest of honor this evening, Colin Kahl. He told me I can make some stuff up so you can see what's true and what isn't. Colin served as the Undersecretary of Defense for Policy at the U.S. Department of Defense in the Biden administration until July last year. The greatest one that was, from what I've heard. He was also Deputy Assistant to President Obama and National Security Advisor to the Vice President from October 2014 to January 2017, as well as Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for the Middle East from February 2009 to December 2011. And I think it's needless to say that he's been on the front lines of some of the most pressing and critical challenges, foreign policy challenges of our day. So I'm sure he will bring lots of great insights, hopefully, to us tonight. He is also the Stephen C. Hazy Senior Fellow at Stanford University's Freeman Spogli Institute for International Studies and previously taught at Georgetown University and the University of Minnesota. Before I give the floor over to him, just let me say a few words about the format this evening. He will come up here in just a minute, give us a presentation of about 30 minutes, followed by a brief discussion on stage and an audience Q&A. The onstage discussion will be very ably led by our fall 2023 Presidential Fellow, Michael Doyle, who is University Professor at the School of International and Public Affairs at Columbia University. He's going to ask Colin a few questions, hard ones, hopefully, after which they will open it up to the floor to the audience. As I mentioned earlier, this visitorship is really meant to inspire frank and civil exchange. So in that spirit, I hope you will all already start thinking of great questions to ask them. If you're joining us at the Academy at that time, please raise your hand. And if you're in the Zoom, please type in the Q&A portion of the chat. And with that, I ask Colin to join you on here.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Anna, and thanks to Dan in his absence. It's a great joy to be in Berlin and to be with the American Academy. It's also a real honor to give a lecture with Jim Mattis's name attached to it. Obviously, he was a Secretary of Defense in a different political party than the one that I served, but I've known Secretary Mattis and before that General Mattis for a couple of decades now and consider him a good friend, and we are now colleagues at Stanford. So it's great to be able to give a lectureship in his name. Thank you for the kind introduction. I joked with Anna that the only question that was allowed was, were you a great undersecretary or the greatest undersecretary? Hence the reference earlier. The answer is probably neither. But I should at least give you 30 seconds about what the heck the Undersecretary of Defense for Policy is, since there are a lot of people in the audience that should have either in the room or online that will have no idea. And the easiest way to think of the Undersecretary of Defense for Policy is that your job is to be the national security advisor to the Secretary of Defense. So I oversaw an organization, a core organization of about 800. But when you added up the agencies that reported to me, it was about 3,000 people with a budget of about $700 million, which is pretty small for Pentagon standards, but pretty big for everywhere else. And our job was to essentially provide substantive and policy support to the Secretary of Defense on every country and region and topic and functional domain in the world. So my job was, I didn't buy the weapons or maintain the weapons or deal with our readiness issues or personnel issues. I wasn't his lawyer. I wasn't his budget person, but I was his policy person. And in the 2.5 years that I served as the Undersecretary of Defense for Policy, obviously we were dealing with a pretty tumultuous world. I arrived a few weeks after President Biden's decision to withdraw from Afghanistan. And then, of course, in August of 2021, we had to contend with the collapse of the government in Kabul and the evacuation from Afghanistan. And then it was a very short period after that where the onrushing train of Putin's invasion of Ukraine was confronting our government and the rest of the world, and most especially the Ukrainians themselves. And so managing the lead up to that conflict and the American response from my perch at the Pentagon. And I'm proud to say that of the roughly $45 billion that the United States has provided to Ukraine's military during this conflict, every single one of those security assistance packages came up through my office. Until July, that is. So obviously was very involved in that. Another big part of what my job was, though, of course, was representing the Secretary of Defense in the so-called interagency process. So our dialogue with the State Department, the White House, the CIA, the Treasury Department, and other agencies and departments. I was also the Secretary's representative at what we call the Deputies Committee, which if you think of the president and the cabinet, the deputies are one layer below that. And a lot of the national security decision-making actually culminates at the deputies level. So worked a lot with my colleagues on all these issues. I also played a role for the secretary in shaping defense diplomacy and had a lot of engagements with my counterparts, to include my German counterparts from around the world on just about every topic. But one of the things the secretary tasked me to do in 2021 was to lead the team that drafted the National Defense Strategy, or the NDS. What is the NDS? And I'm going to explain it to you because it's actually going to be the frame through which my remarks are shaped. At times, it's going to be a little wonky from the defense perspective, but I think it'll give you a good idea of how the Pentagon within the U.S. government saw emerging trends in the international environment and how the United States needed to posture itself to be able to keep it safe in a world that was ever more dangerous. Essentially, the National Defense Strategy is a document that the Pentagon puts out about every 4 years. It is designed to nest underneath the national security strategy. The United States it's not unique in the world, but there aren't a lot of countries, although I know Germany has now put out its own national security strategy. But by law, we have to produce a document that describes our grand strategy for navigating the world every few years. And typically this happens during the first or second year of an administration and then the first or second year of a second term. In the Biden administration, obviously, Joe Biden has a pretty different worldview than his predecessor. And so the thought was that we wouldn't have time to wait a year or two before putting some marker on the board as it relates to our national security objectives. So actually, during the transition from President Trump to President Biden, I drafted what became the interim National Security Strategic Guidance, which was actually a document that came out about a month before I was confirmed, that kind of in 20 pages described what Joe Biden wanted to achieve on the world stage and allowed us to kind of, I think, tread water on the national security doctrine as we took the reins and moved forward. The actual national security strategy was supposed to be published in early of 2022, but was delayed for obvious reasons to account for events in Ukraine. The national defense strategy is the way in which the Pentagon kind of manifests the national security strategy in the military context. And so it's a very important document because, first of all, at the Pentagon, people actually read the documents and salute smartly and march out on them. So what's written on paper matters. But also, it's I think, an interesting window into how the Pentagon tried to execute what the President of the United States was trying to achieve. So it comes out in two forms. Typically, it comes out in a classified document and an unclassified document. Usually, those are released at the same time. They were not in this instance. Because the national security strategy was delayed, but we needed to release the classified version of the national defense strategy so we could justify a defense budget that was in the neighborhood of $800 billion for fiscal year 23. So we released the national defense strategy in the spring of 2022, and then we released the unclassified version shortly after the national security strategy was released in the fall of 2022. So when we were putting together this document starting in 2021, as I was entering office, the first thing, of course, we had to do was offer our evaluation of the security environment. And one of the interesting things, at least from my perspective, was, I'd worked in the Obama administration at the White House, the Pentagon originally, and then at the White House at the end. And I was there until midnight on January 19th of 2017. So, about half a day before the inauguration. And what really struck me coming back just 4 years later, not really that much time, was how much harder the world was. Now, I think, we could look back and perhaps, assess that there were things that were already happening at the end of the Obama administration that maybe the Obama administration had not completely taken on board. I think that would be a fair critique. But it was also just the case that the turbulence of the Trump years, the impact of COVID, and a number of other changes that happened in that 4-year period, the world was just different. It felt different. It felt harder. The stakes felt bigger. And the job felt all the more weightier. I will give a lot of credit to Jim Mattis and his team for the 2018 National Defense Strategy, which did some things actually I'm not sure a Democratic administration could have done, which was to make a pivot away from the 9/11 framing of U.S. national security. So after 9/11, for obvious reasons, U.S. grand strategy was framed largely around the so-called global war on terrorism. Obviously, the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq were a big part of that, but there was a broader campaign against terrorist organizations. The threat that groups like Al-Qaeda and later ISIS posed to the United States homeland, but also our interests abroad, was the preeminent national security challenge that drove the Defense Department and the rest of the security sector in the United States. The 2018 National Defense Strategy was important because it basically said that terrorism, while still a significant threat to the United States, was now a secondary security issue compared to the most important security issue, which was the resurgence of great power competition or major power competition with China and Russia, increasingly assertive. Since the ascendance of Xi Jinping in the 2012-2013 timeframe, you'd seen China become more assertive in places like the South China Sea and in the East China Sea, and in 2020 in Hong Kong. There were growing concerns that China would make a move on Taiwan. Of course, Vladimir Putin had intervened in Ukraine the first time back in 2014 and illegally seized Crimea and stirred up the separatist movement in the Donbass and eastern Ukraine. There was also the intervention by the Russians in Syria, and so was clearly marching out on the global stage to assert Russian military power in all sorts of ways. And I give the Trump administration and the Pentagon team in particular a lot of credit for putting that great power framework really in the foreground of our thinking. So the idea in 2022 was not to overturn everything that had come before us, but to try to refine the analysis. And one of the ways that we tried to do that was to distinguish. Yes, we are in an era of resurgent major power competition. I'm a political scientist. Political scientists can debate whether we're still in a unipolar world or a bipolar one or a multipolar one or a uni-multipolar one or whatever. I have confusion just saying all those words out loud. But I think that there was a sense that the 2018 document got it right, that there was a resurgence of major power competition, but that China and Russia were not the same type of actors. And therefore, to say that great power competition was back only tells you so much, and that we needed to meaningfully distinguish the challenge that Russia and China posed. And so in the case of China, the document describes China as the Pentagon's quote unquote pacing challenge. And both of those words, pacing and challenge, matter a lot. Pacing, because it is the competitor to which our activities have to be paced, matched, the standard to which we have to achieve and surpass. Challenge, because we do not presume that China is a threat or an enemy or an adversary, and we do not presume that a conflict with China is either imminent or inevitable. So pacing challenge. I think, and the national security strategy is clear on this too, that China is by far the most consequential competitor of the United States across the board. They, in our estimate, and I think in most analysts' estimates, they are the only country in the world that combines the capability, economic, technological, diplomatic, and increasingly military capability, and the intent under Xi Jinping to supplant the United States as the world's most powerful and influential actor, and to rewire the world and the rules and institutions that undergird the kind of post-World War II era in a way that is more compatible with the interests and values of the Chinese Communist Party. And that's a big deal. There hasn't been a transition like that in international politics in a long, long time. And the last time it happened between two democracies, the United States and Great Britain. So that's a big deal. Russia is not that kind of competitor. Russia is capable of blowing up the world, but they are not capable of dominating the world. And that's an important distinction. And so the national defense strategy describes Russia as an acute threat. And again, both those words are intentional. Acute meaning sharp and immediate, and threat meaning threat. Even before the war in Ukraine manifest in February of 2022, Russia was described by that in the drafts of the document. So the war in Ukraine really validated the assessment. It did not tell us something that we did not know. Of course, Russia and China are not the only state actors that challenge U.S. interests and global security. Among the others none of which will surprise you, are North Korea and Iran. And of course, there are non-state actors like ISIS and Al-Qaeda and other violent extremist organizations that the document recognizes we have to take seriously. But one thing that is very different, so if one difference with the 2018 document is this trying to draw a greater distinction between China and Russia as challenges, another distinction is that, for understandable reasons, the 2018 document did not grapple with so-called transboundary problems. These are problems that emanate from the actions of humanity, but you can think of them kind of as the negative externalities of the things we do going about our lives. They can nevertheless pose significant and in some cases existential challenges to our way of life, especially in an increasingly interdependent and globalized world. We all lived through a version of this with COVID. And of course, the concern that is front of mind is these days is climate change. And there's a lot of accusations in Washington that the Pentagon caring about this stuff suddenly is proof that Joe Biden has made the Pentagon woke. There are a lot of reasons why that argument makes absolutely no sense, but the biggest one is that climate change every single day has an impact on our military operations. It has flooded, as a consequence of more extreme storms. We've seen the flooding of U.S. military bases, destroying valuable equipment, costing billions of dollars in damage. At one point, the head of our nuclear command was 6 feet underwater because of extreme water in the middle of our country. at the time that a cyclone was burying the entire country of Mozambique in an equivalent period. Just think how much worse it would be if climate change wasn't a hoax. It's a joke. But I'll give you one other data point which always struck me in terms of the impact it has on Department of Defense personnel. There are a lot of wildfires in North America these days. In the year 2019, the U.S. National Guard spent 18,000 person days fighting wildfires. That's a lot. So our National Guard, which is supposed to be there to defend the country and respond to emergencies, spent 18,000 person days fighting wildfires in 2019. In 2021, they spent 172,000 person days fighting wildfires. Okay? Now tell me that it's about the woke Pentagon. It's not about the woke Pentagon. It's about reality. Climate change is changing our world, and it's having a real impact on U.S. military operations. In the homeland, it'll have impacts in important regions like the Middle East and the Indo-Pacific and elsewhere. Sometimes this past summer, there were heat waves everywhere for a combination of natural and human-induced climate change reasons. And, every single year you hear this term, this was the hottest year in this century. That's the wrong way to think about it. This is the coldest year for the rest of this century. All right? And to say that that's not going to impact our security, even in the narrow way in which militaries think about it, is to stick one's head in the sand. So the National Defense Strategy said that we have to come to grips with both aspects, this re-emergent world of great power competition and this world in which there were transboundary challenges that no country alone could confront. And so what that meant for the U.S. Military is that we had to be strong enough and command enough of our enduring advantages to deter our adversaries from doing things that would threaten U.S. interests, and if deterrence fails, prevail in conflict against our adversaries, and that we needed to be sufficiently resilient in the face of these enormous transboundary challenges. So that was a frame, and of course that was different from 2018 as well. Of course, the last point that the National Defense Strategy recognized was the impact of changing technologies on the security landscape. Now, some of these technologies are not new. One of them, one of the biggest ones have been around for, more than 75 years, which is nuclear weapons. Obviously, the United States has a sizable nuclear arsenal, although nothing compared to what we had during the Cold War. But our rivals and adversaries are increasing the salience of nuclear weapons in their national security strategies. Obviously, Russia has the world's largest nuclear stockpile, and among the major nuclear powers is thought to have the lowest threshold for the possible use of nuclear weapons. And this is something that we grappled with in the context of Ukraine, and happy to talk about that in the discussion period if people are interested. China is in the midst of tripling, potentially quadrupling or even quintupling their nuclear arsenal between now and the mid-2030s, which is not only a challenge in and of itself, but will bring about a condition that the United States has never experienced before, which is living with not one but two nuclear superpower peers at the same time, and two peers that are increasingly aligned with one another. North Korea has been on a missile spree for the last few years and continues to develop nuclear weapons and the delivery vehicles for those nuclear weapons. And of course, Iran has kind of been in a two steps forward, one step back relationship with its nuclear program for a while. But since the Trump administration jettisoned the Iran nuclear deal, Iran has moved from being about 12 months from being able to produce one bomb's worth of fissile material to being able to do that in less than 2 weeks. And so they are not a nuclear armed state, but they, in some respects, are a threshold state. And so the world is becoming more nuclear, not less. The salience of those weapons is going up, at least for our challengers and adversaries. So those are old technologies, but there are a bunch of new technologies that define the scope of warfare to include domains that matter more and more for modern life. And the two I would highlight are cyberspace and outer space. And so the document focuses very much on those domains. And of course, those domains are very commingled with the nuclear domain in ways that raise significant questions about strategic stability. These were conversations we were having with the Russians before the Ukraine war put that on ice. They are conversations we'd like to have with the People's Republic of China, but the PRC leadership has been resistant to having those conversations. And then there are the emerging technologies that will define our lives and, frankly, the way countries fight in the years ahead, most prominent among them being artificial intelligence and various forms of autonomy. Closely associated is the role of drones and other uncrewed systems. We're seeing that play out every single day in places like Ukraine, but also I suspect as things escalate in Israel, you'll see a prominent role for drones in that context as well on both sides. So there's artificial intelligence, there's uncrewed systems, but other developments, synthetic biology, quantum science, hypersonics, directed energy, advances in electronic warfare. The entire nature of warfare is changing, and none of these technologies are siloed from one another. So we had to come to grips with that. So to say the least, it's a complex world. And part of my job as undersecretary was to help the secretary craft a strategy around these fundamental structural changes and trends, and to be able to do that even as every single day we were dealing with the crisis of the day. Right, and that crisis could be the evacuation from Afghanistan, but it could also be things no one anticipated, like the need to fly special forces halfway across North Africa to evacuate our diplomats from Sudan because Sudan fell into a civil war. And believe me, I didn't have Chinese high altitude balloon on my bingo card either, even though the PRC was listed as our pacing challenge. I just didn't realize it was our pacing challenge in near space, in addition to actual space. So trying to do both at the same time, managing the crises of the day and the strategy in front of you is hard but important. Let me say a few more. I'm going to focus the remainder of my remarks on kind of China's theory of victory over the United States and how the United States needs to think about, at least from the military perspective, how we've thought about responding. So as I said, the National Defense Strategy describes China as our pacing challenge. But of course, we have been China's pacing challenge for decades. Going back to the Gulf War, which demonstrated a degree of U.S. military prowess that I think shocked many would-be competitors, but also the 95-96 Taiwan Strait crisis, where I think the leadership in Beijing felt humiliated. And then, of course, the bombing, unintentional, but nevertheless impactful bombing of the Chinese embassy in Belgrade in the context of the 1999 Kosovo war. All of these things, I think, very much fixated the Chinese leadership on pacing to the challenge of the United States. As a consequence, the PRC has engaged in a breathtaking military modernization, part of which is aimed at enabling rapid offensive operations in so-called fait accompli scenarios. That is, the ability to achieve decisive military objectives in their neighborhood so fast that the United States cannot effectively intervene to stop them. Now, of course, if China is the pacing challenge, the pacing scenario in this context is Taiwan. And that will surprise nobody in this room. The PRC has made significant investments in this context in so-called A2AD, which is not a robot from Star Wars, but stands for anti-access area denial systems that are designed to hold the U.S. military at risk out to the first island chain and beyond. And by that, it means that any U.S. military en masse that moves into that bubble can be destroyed. Or disrupted. And so what have they been doing? They've been building extraordinarily advanced air defense systems, air superiority systems like fourth and fifth generation fighters. They've been investing in the world's largest naval buildup, the world's largest and most advanced arsenal of ballistic missiles, cruise missiles, and hypersonic missiles, a growing array of uncrewed and undersea capabilities, and so-called kill chains, enabled by huge investments in space-based intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance and communications to keep custody of U.S. forces as they leave the western coast of the United States, track them all the way across the Pacific, and target them with lethal force if so desired. And much of that architecture relies on outer space, a domain that most people think of in terms of moon landings and Elon Musk wanting to go to Mars or whatever, but in China's case is central to their thinking about a potential fight with the United States. Key to China's theory of victory over the United States would likely entail efforts to blind and deafen U.S. military power, slow us down, disrupting mobilization and power projection, and turn us inward in the homeland. So they have invested capabilities to engage in significant attacks against U.S. cyber networks and our space architecture, which was built for a very different and much more benign world. They've invested in the ability to attack critical infrastructure in the U.S. homeland and abroad that are key to U.S. force mobilization and power projection. So think airports, power plants, ports, those types of things. And technology-enabled disinformation operations meant to create turbulence in the U.S. political system during a crisis. Last but not least, Beijing intends all of this to happen under the lengthening shadow of their growing nuclear arsenal. And I think they are looking at the conflict in Ukraine and saying, look, we may be able to accomplish our objectives and use our nuclear deterrent to keep the American intervention at arm's length instead of being direct. So this was, if you were going to craft a strategy around your pacing challenge, you have to understand what the other side thinks, how they're thinking about defeating you, and then try to figure out what you can do about that. So given all of this, the central premise of the national defense strategy is the need to sustain and strengthen deterrence. Deterrence just means dissuading the other side from engaging in aggression that would threaten your interests. And in this case, that means deterring the PRC from taking actions against our allies and partners or against the United States that would fundamentally threaten U.S. Interests. Of course, deterrence also matters for countries like Russia and Iran and North Korea. And I'm happy to talk about it in those other contexts as well, but I'm going to focus on the China piece. A cornerstone of the national defense strategy is what the Secretary of Defense has called integrated deterrence, which requires us to leverage cutting-edge technologies across the entire domain, all the domains of conflict. So not just air, sea, undersea, land, but also increasingly cyberspace and outer space. Also across the entire spectrum of conflict. So not only kind of high-end conventional and nuclear issues, but at the low end, gray zone and proxy conflicts and kind of everywhere in between. It also requires us to integrate our capabilities across the various instruments of power, not just our military capabilities, but our non-military capabilities, our intelligence, our economics, our diplomacy, and I can talk to you a little bit more about that in the Ukraine context if you're interested. And it also requires us to integrate deterrence efforts across our allies and partnerships, because the United States believes, and I think this is right, that what distinguishes us from every other country in the world and every other great power, frankly, in the history of the world, is the sheer breadth and depth of our alliance and partnership network across the globe. It is our asymmetric advantage. And so if we are going to try to deter challengers and adversaries from doing things, it's a team sport, and we have to work alongside our allies. And of course, we also need to do all of this in a way that deters bad things from happening, but also positions us to prevail if deterrence fails, because deterrence can fail. So both deterrence and prevailing in conflict requires the U.S. military to be capable of denying a potential adversary's operational objectives. If they're trying to achieve X, you need to deny them from being able to achieve X. So that means, in the context of the Western Pacific, having the ability of U.S. forces to stand in and fight inside China's A2AD bubbles, these anti-access area denial bubbles, the ability to operate inside the kill box that they have set up for us. So what does that mean? Major investments in undersea capabilities. U.S. submarines are the envy of the world. It is the one area of U.S. military overmatch that is likely to persist for the longest period of time, and we need to lean into that. Second, uncrewed and autonomous air, maritime, and undersea systems, so that you're not always putting human beings in harm's way. They're uncrewed and can be increasingly networked with one another and able to operate even when communications are frustrated. And some of you may have seen that my good friend, Deputy Secretary of Defense Kath Hicks, recently announced the so-called Replicator Initiative, which was essentially to leverage emerging technologies in uncrewed and autonomous systems to provide large numbers of attritable uncrewed systems to operate very close to adversaries with thick and deadly anti-access and area denial capabilities. We've also worked hard to distribute, to come up with concepts for distributing air and maritime operations. We've developed more mobile, distributed, lethal, and survivable ground forces. The Marines have completely remade themselves to focus on Pacific scenarios. And of course, we've learned from Ukraine, but we want to translate this to other partners around the world, including the Pacific, the value of asymmetric capabilities so that the partner itself, the target of the aggression, the David in the David and Goliath story can tie Goliath up in knots. So we have to be able to stand in all of those ways. We also need to be able to stand off to fight from beyond anti-access area denial bubbles, which is why the U.S. Department of Defense requested that Congress enable major investments in long-range fires, so much greater investments in missile capabilities, traditional missiles, but also hypersonics and long-range subsonic missiles. Just in the FY24 budget request, $11 billion was requested for these types of systems. Also modernizing our Air Force, the fourth and fifth generation fighter aircraft, but also developing next generation aircraft that can team with drones and next generation aircraft that can deliver effects from very far away, like the B-21 stealth strategic bomber that will be entering into service in the near future. And again, just to give you a scope, the president's budget this year, which has not yet been approved, asked for $61 billion of investments in these types of capabilities. Denial, of course, denying the adversary's objectives also requires you to defend yourself, because part of what they're trying to do is defeat you. So you need to be able to defend yourself. So the Department of Defense has made major investments in being able to counter potential adversaries' ability to track and target U.S. forces, whether that be from space or cyberspace or other domains. We were also making major investments in integrated air and missile defense, both in theaters, but also in the U.S. homeland. Cyber defenses to prevent and blunt attacks on critical networks, and space capabilities to defend our assets on orbit that are essential for everything the U.S. military does. I will just say, again, most people don't focus on outer space very much, but China understands that the entire American way of war runs through outer space. It's how we see things, it's how we communicate, it's how we navigate, and they want to hold that architecture at risk. It's incumbent upon us to not let that happen. Which brings me to the next important area of deterrence, which is resilience. That is, the attack surface, as it relates to the U.S. military, is simply too big to deny every instance of aggression or defend yourself in every instance. And if our way of war relies on networks, those networks themselves have to be resilient to disruption. That is, even when you fail to prevent the other side from initiating attack, or even when you get hit, you have to be able to roll with the punches. So again, a lot of the investments that are happening in cyberspace and in outer space are meant to do just that, to absorb a punch and keep functioning. And one of the areas where the investments are made the most is in outer space, where the U.S. military is very keen to capitalize on the explosion of commercial space capabilities. The number of satellites on orbit has doubled just in the last couple of years, largely as a consequence of the activities of companies like SpaceX. So to leverage that explosion in commercial space to develop more proliferated architectures, so that a potential adversary can't look at the U.S. architecture and say, look, there are only a dozen or 24 juicy targets that are easy to blow out of the sky. So just to give you a sense of how much the U.S. is investing in this, in fiscal year 23, the defense budget invested more than $30 billion in space, and this year's budget increased that request to $33 billion. That is more than most countries spend on their entire military put together, and that is the yearly investment that the Biden administration has chosen to make in space. But we've also tried to change our physical posture here on planet Earth so it would be more resilient to possible attack. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in just a second. We've also tried to take steps to make our critical infrastructure at home more resilient and to build more resilient supply chains and a more resilient defense industrial base. Needs that were identified before the war in Ukraine, but have been, the need for that has been, of course, magnified by the war in Ukraine. Finally, defending yourself, denying the other side, being resilient, all of that is good. All of that is necessary. It's key to deterrence, but you also need to be able to impose costs in the final analysis if those other forms of deterrence prove insufficient. And that's why the United States decided, somewhat controversially for a Democratic president, to continue to make a generational investment in modernizing the U.S. nuclear triad. Because at the end of the day, nuclear weapons, especially in a world where adversaries and challengers, the salience of nuclear weapons going up, not going down, remain the ultimate backstop, not only of U.S. security, but I'm standing here in Berlin. It's also the backstop for our extended deterrence commitments to countries in NATO, to our bilateral treaty allies in the Indo-Pacific as well. But it's not enough to just have that nuclear backstop. You also have to be able to impose costs both through your conventional military forces, but through non-military forces. And here, the part of integrated deterrence that relies on non-military tools is increasingly important. The ability to threaten an adversary with a degree of international isolation matters, and the degree to threaten the adversary with financial and economic penalties that they care about matters. Now, these threats were made against Vladimir Putin in the lead up to the invasion of Ukraine. He didn't believe us. And then, of course, sanctions fell on the Russian economy like a ton of bricks, and the Russian economy has been able to muddle through, but only by in a massively unbalanced and unsustainable way of leaning into their military industrial complex. When it comes to China, it's my view that leadership in Beijing ultimately, if they ever make a decision about using force against Taiwan, the leadership in Beijing will ask themselves a basic question. Will the world respond like they did against when Russia invaded Ukraine, or will they respond like they did when China absorbed Hong Kong? If it is the latter, the possibility of a conflict across the Taiwan Strait is much higher. If it is the former, not just from a military perspective, but from an economic and diplomatic perspective, deterrence will be much stronger. And the reason for that is that the Chinese leadership has a theory of national greatness, which requires China to be integrated into the global economy to a much greater degree than Vladimir Putin required. And so it makes them nervous. The prospect that democracies would be willing to impose the types of costs through sanctions, export controls, and other actions that Putin experienced. Now, of course, China also has a lot more economic leverage, so we can have a conversation about how likely it is that the world is to impose those costs. But it's just to say that it's not just the military costs that can be imposed, but these non-military ones that I think China will care about very much. Which brings us to what the United States sees a bit as our ace in the hole, which is our allies and partners, and this is where I'll conclude. So the concept of integrated deterrence requires us to work alongside U.S. and allies and partners. Close collaboration with allies and partners has been the foundation of U.S. foreign policy for a long time, although it was a little rocky in recent years. But we don't see any other way to address the challenge posed by China or Russia or other potential challengers and adversaries than working with our friends. In the Q&A, I'd be happy to talk to you about how we've managed the allies and partners as it relates to the war in Ukraine, which has been a huge undertaking and I think a very successful and impactful one. And obviously you've seen, if Vladimir Putin went into the war in Ukraine hoping to Finlandize NATO, of course he has NATOized Finland, and hopefully soon Sweden. NATO is more united and stronger than at any time in my lifetime, and Russia's conventional military power is more attrited and weaker than at any time in my adult lifetime. And those are meaningful outcomes. But let me just say a few things. All of that is very familiar to a German audience. Let me tell you just a few things about stuff that's happening on the other side of the world in terms of what the United States has been investing in. In Japan, we've been extraordinarily supportive as Japan itself has committed to significantly increasing their defense budget and to acquire capabilities like counterstrike missile capabilities that would have been unthinkable just a few years ago, but largely is a reaction to Tokyo's growing concerns over China. It's also the case that Japan has agreed to change the shape of U.S. military posture in Japan, to change the composition of Marines operating outside of Okinawa, so that a much more lethal and mobile and relevant contingent of Marines will now operate out of Okinawa, but also to think about other locations in Japan that would be relevant for a Taiwan contingency, which matters, of course, very much for Japan. If you just look at a map, when then Speaker of the House Pelosi visited Taiwan last summer, the summer of 2022, China responded with a massive missile volley over Taiwan. Some of those missiles landed in Japan's exclusive economic zone. That wasn't lost on leadership in Tokyo. And as a result, I think Japan understands that Japan very much has skin in the game in a Taiwan contingency. With the ROK, South Korea, the focus of our alliance has long been North Korea, and it still is. And this administration has done a lot to strengthen the extended deterrence relationship with South Korea. You saw that on display with the so-called Washington Declaration when President Yoon visited Washington for a state visit this past summer. But what is remarkable about the ROK is that increasingly, I think the national security leadership there understands that it's not just North Korea, but also China that poses a challenge throughout East Asia, and one that South Korea has to factor into its equation. And I think that's part of the explanation for not only a deepening bilateral relationship between South Korea and the United States, but a deepening trilateral relationship at some political risk, I should say, in both Seoul and Tokyo, between the United States, Japan, and the ROK on things like missile defense and joint exercises and data sharing, which, yes, is about North Korea, but, yes, is also about a broader set of considerations in the Indo-Pacific. Another country that we've done a lot with is Australia. The physical presence and posture of the United States and Australia has expanded considerably, and that's in a bilateral context. But of course, in 2021, there was also the announcement of the AUKUS deal, and there was understandably a lot of focus on the joint effort between the United States, the UK, and Australia to build a conventionally armed, nuclear-powered submarine, which will be a game changer in terms of the deterrence factor in the region, especially given the quality of those submarines. But AUKUS is just as important for a second pillar, which will focus on jointly developing emerging technologies like uncrewed and autonomous systems, cyberspace, quantum, and other capabilities. This year, we've seen significant expansions in the U.S. force posture in the Philippines, which is relevant not only to living up to U.S. commitments to our treaty ally in Manila, as it contends with Chinese provocations in places like the South China Sea, but is also relevant as tensions continue to go up around Taiwan. And then last but not least is the deepening bilateral and multilateral relationship involving India. The most consequential demographic power in the world now, one of the world's most dynamic economies. I think objectively, one can say will be one of the most consequential actors for the remainder of the 21st century. And I think that the leadership in New Delhi, while I think very much conscious of India's traditional role as kind of a neutral power that doesn't take sides, has increasingly become strategically concerned with the actions in Beijing. I think if you had asked me 10 years ago, the number one security challenge for India, it would have been, the top three would have been Pakistan, Pakistan, and Pakistan. And now I don't think that's true. I think Pakistan is still very high up on the list, but is nested underneath a broader concern about China, which of course was magnified by the border clashes in 2020 and continues to be an issue. So you've seen deepening defense and technological cooperation between the United States and India. Again, that was on display this past summer when Prime Minister Modi came to Washington for a summit with President Biden. But it's not just the bilateral relationship. It's also, here in Europe, we think the Quad is the United States, France, Germany, and the UK, and it still is. But there is an Indo-Pacific Quad, which is India, the United States, Japan, and Australia. And the relevance of the Quad for managing a whole host of international affairs in that part of the world has gone up dramatically under this administration, and all to the good. And so I think together these efforts have left U.S. alliances in the transatlantic security community, in the Indo-Pacific, in better shape than in many, many years. Now, can that be sustained? We'll have to see. But I think it is a reflection of dynamics, threat perceptions and concerns in Europe and in the Indo-Pacific, but also a continuing fact that many countries still turn to the United States as the first place of safe harbor when confronting these types of challenges. So sorry for going on for so long. Hopefully I've given you some food for thought, Michael, and I look forward to the discussion.
I've got a few questions to ask you, but I'm only going to do two because I know this is an eager audience in front of us here. One was that one of the things that I found extraordinarily impressive about your description of the national defense strategy, the national strategy, was its scope. That is, that we've moved out of the simple, strategy of guns to looking at guns and butter and politics and technology and all these things coming together. It's also sensitive to a very dynamic world. As you described at the beginning, the world has got much more, at least seemingly dangerous than it was 4, 10, 15 years ago. So the first question I have is, can we keep the parts of this grand strategic progress together? And let me give you two areas where I see some strains. And first of all, I commend this strategy for recognizing the diversity. But the question is, can we put a whole together that's sustainable? One is that you've described China as our pacing challenge, and it certainly is. And therefore, at least from the Chinese point of view, it looks like our efforts to deter them are efforts to contain them. And so they read it in a much more challenging way than we might ourselves be planning, but they see themselves as facing sort of a new containment threat. And it makes them disturbed, angry, et cetera, and we've seen the statements that come out. And I think you made a good case that that's a reasonable way for the U.S. to see the world, that is, as a pacing challenge, and that we need to take it into account. At the same time, you have, and the administration has identified as another existential challenge the new areas, and most importantly, right now, climate. We could also add in COVID, but climate. And the irony is that in order to succeed on climate, we absolutely have to have China and India working with the U.S. No matter how virtuous we are with the IRA and whatever progress we make catching up with the Europeans on climate, none of that does any good unless we persuade China and India to be more ambitious for us to meet the global targets and make for a sustainable planet. So on the one hand, we're, so to speak, containing China. And on the other hand, we're asking them to make a series of significant policy changes that allow us together, cooperatively, to save the planet. So that's one set of tension that I see. And the second, this is not going to be a long question, is that, we've dealt with, or dealing with, the challenge of Putin's invasion of Ukraine. And the president has eloquently said, we will be there as long as it takes. And he just said the same thing yesterday to Israel, that we'll be there as long as it takes. And Netanyahu, by the press reports, has given him a significant list of weapon systems that he wants. And the question is, how many of these, as long as it takes, can we handle? We have two major ones right now. There could be other ones. I was very pleased to say that we didn't rush into Nagorno-Karabakh, but there could be other ones out there. And so the beauty of the National Defense Strategy is its comprehensiveness, in my opinion. It's gone away from the old narrow strategies. The challenge is that you're taking on parts that are contradictory and are somewhat at war with each other. So how does that look for the architect of our national defense strategy? How do you keep the building standing up, I guess is the question.
Well, first of all, thank you for that. There's a lot to unpack in that. I will try to be brief because I have a tendency of talking too much. You've already heard that. But actually, I wanted to dissect a couple things. Can we keep it up? Is anything that we're doing now sustainable? I think ultimately is a question is a matter of two things. One, can we continue to make the investments we need to make in ourselves? In the U.S. case, I'm thinking of in the investments through the infrastructure bill, the Chips and Science Act, the oddly named IRA, which was the Inflation Reduction Act, which was really, in many respects, a kind of economic competitiveness and climate act. It's not clear that we'll be able to sustain those types of things. And obviously, some of those measures were also controversial in Europe for the perception that they favored U.S. industries over those in other countries. But I think the bigger question on sustainability is a question of U.S. democracy and whether the United States can govern. And I think that there's a lot of anxiety a year out from the U.S. presidential election about the outcome of that election. And whether, I ended my speech by claiming, and people can challenge this if they have a different view, that U.S. alliances and partnerships are in a better position now than they've been in a long, long time. But the question is for how long? If there is either change at the top in Washington or just such disarray and turmoil that we can't get anything done. Obviously, the drama in the House of Representatives with there not being a speaker with all the debates about Ukraine, which I think we will then see a version of that play out on Israel, and I'll come back to that in a second. But at the end of the day, if the United States can't govern ourselves, then it's hard for us to exercise leadership or friendship or reliable partnership with our allies and partners around the world. Can we deter China without that tipping into something worse? I was a grad student at Columbia, where Michael teaches. I was a grad student of Bob Jervis, who's one of the greatest thinkers in international relations. And Jervis put forward two models of the world, the deterrence model and the spiral model. And the problem is they contradict one another. The deterrence model says if conflict is about checking aggressors and greedy actors on the world stage, then you build yourself up, you threaten incredibly the use of force, and you deter them from doing stuff. But if actually those actors are driven by insecurity, then those same actions actually create a spiral of conflict. And so I think we have been very mindful that the actions to deter China are not an invitation to have a conflict with China. It would be disastrous for China. It would be disastrous for the United States. It would be disastrous for the world economy. Nobody wants a conflict between China and the United States. And so we've been very conscious that we want to find narrow areas to cooperate with them, to include on issues like climate change. We will compete just like they are competing against us, and we'd like to build guardrails around our relationship so that our competition does not spiral into an inadvertent incident in the South China Sea or the Taiwan Strait or the East China Sea or where have you. But it does raise this question that is that there's a fundamental tension between the kind of zero-sum view that some have of the compete and deter China and the need to work with China on pressing challenges, not the least of which being climate change. It is irrefutable that we cannot as a human race address climate change if both the United States and China don't act, right? They're the two largest carbon emitters. The Paris Climate Accord, for all of its flaws, wouldn't have been possible in the absence of some initial agreement between Washington and Beijing. So you need to be able to cooperate on issues like climate change. And, if Secretary Kerry were here, he works on this every single day. I think the argument, though, that the administration has, and again, people can challenge this, is that whether we described our competitive relationship with China as zero-sum or not, the leadership in Beijing views it that way. So we could change our perspective, and it actually wouldn't change their perspective all that much. The second thing is, it's not clear to me why we have to accommodate China on everything that's in its interest or vice versa to get them to do something that's demonstrably in their interest. They would not address climate change because it's a favor to Washington. It is just as big an existential threat, in fact, probably a bigger one, given their environmental and resource and water constraints in China and their demographics. It's a bigger threat to them than us. So one way to put it is, I shouldn't have to bribe Beijing to do something that's in their interests, and certainly not trade away our alliance network in East Asia or the relationship, the commitments we've made on Taiwan. The other issue is that any cooperation on any issue is a bargaining outcome. And I think the Biden administration believes that we will be better positioned to bargain when we bring the rest of the free world, or as much of the rest of the free world with us, to the table. And so making coalitions with advanced economies and liberal democracies in Europe and the Indo-Pacific allow us to come into conversations with Beijing on trade, on economics, on the environment, from a position of strength. The last is competition does not necessarily have to be a race to the bottom. It can be a race to the top. So if the United States and China are going to compete for who is going to develop the cheapest renewable energy, great. Awesome. The world will benefit from that competition. All right. So there are ways in which competition can actually generate positive outcomes for the world. Trade-offs between Ukraine and Israel, we don't know. I think what the Ukraine war has demonstrated is that the defense industrial base in the United States and elsewhere, as robust as it is, did not anticipate an extended high-intensity conventional war. And so we're catching up to that. And so a lot of what's been provided to Ukraine came out of American stockpiles, came out of German stockpiles, came out of UK stockpiles and others, and that has to be replenished and rejuvenated. And big investments have been made in the defense industrial base in the United States and here in Europe, and let's see what that produces in the coming years. Israel will also require some things. They have a lot. They will probably be able to sustain themselves for a considerable amount of time because of their emphasis on self-reliance. But it's already been public that at some point they're likely to come to the United States for assistance in replenishing Iron Dome interceptors and precision-guided munitions and those types of things. For the most part, I don't think there's trade space between the types of things Israel will request and the types of things that are required every month to keep Ukraine's military in the game in the conflict with Russia. But where I do think the quite big question mark again, and I'll conclude here, is politics, which is, across the political spectrum, there's been an outpouring of support for Israel. I expect that to continue for some period of time, although the longer these conflicts go historically, the more you see cracks in that. But I think given the scale, scope, and horrific nature of what Hamas did on Saturday, I suspect there to be strong bipartisan support. But we don't even have a Speaker of the House, so getting aid for anybody will be an open question. So I'm hopeful that the Republicans can get their act together in the House. I suspect that there will be an emergency spending bill for Israel. It would not surprise me if Ukraine aid is part of that same conversation. And hopefully we can move forward on both, but I think the world will be watching to see whether the United States can govern as it navigates these two issues.
Great, thank you. One question more, and then I'll turn it over to the audience, and that is that you described a much more complicated and dangerous world, and it's really important in order to navigate that we engage in the kind of foresight and the, let's call it, intellectual resilience that allows us to meet these kinds of challenges. And here the record of the past 2 years is quite remarkable when it comes to intelligence assessments. We had let's call it a failure in Afghanistan to anticipate how quickly the Ghani regime would fall. And then we had one of the most brilliant, as a newspaper reader of all of this, intelligence successes of generations, which was anticipating with incredible accuracy the likelihood and the timing of Putin's attack on Ukraine. And then now, over the past weekend, we've had what Israel recognizes is a very significant intelligence failure via the Hamas attack. And, of course, we've relied on Israel for intelligence in the region, but we also have our independent capabilities of assessing threat. And we've acknowledged that we certainly did not have information that would lead us to warn Israel of an impending Hamas attack. So we've had this roller coaster of intelligence. And my question is, what should we learn from that? Were we just unlucky and lucky and now unlucky again? Or is the world of intelligence assessment become much more challenging so that we're good at some kinds of things and not so good at other kinds of things? The question is, how do we replicate the intelligence success of Ukraine and avoid the failures of Afghanistan and Hamas? Any insights on the use of foresight as a way of meeting these significant challenges that you've described that we're facing?
Yeah, it's a really important question, and I only have a partial answer, which is good because then my answer will only be half as long as it would have normally been. Look, I think as a general matter, in my experience in the U.S. government is we have better intelligence on our adversaries than our partners. And so we understood Russian war plans better than most of the Russian generals did. And I'm not disclosing classified information in saying that because we disclosed it to the world in real time, right? And I think it speaks to the breadth and depth of U.S. intelligence, especially technical intelligence across the board, to be able to gain insight into certain types of adversary behavior. Certainly shocked Russia. I suspect it shocked the leadership in Beijing since, Putin went to Beijing just a couple of weeks before the invasion on the eve of the Beijing Olympics and essentially lied to Xi Jinping's face by telling him that he wasn't going to do exactly what he did 3 weeks later. And apparently nobody around Xi Jinping told the president of China anything different. And he left those meetings believing everything coming out of the Biden administration was Western propaganda. And of course, that wasn't the case. So I think we know a lot. And that the U.S. intelligence community is particularly good at high-end adversaries and technical means and all the rest. I think we know less about our partners, but especially there are just intangible variables that are very difficult to assess, whether you're an intel analyst or a social scientist. And the big one is the will to fight. I think we serially miscalculated the will to fight in Iraq in 2012 through 2014 when the Iraqi security forces did not put up much of a fight, given the ISIS onslaught that swept over a huge portion of the country in the spring and summer of 2014. Certainly, we saw a collapse of the Afghan National Security and Defense Forces much more rapidly than the intelligence community anticipated, given just a collapse in the faith in their own government and how much that evaporated in days and hours in the summer of 2021. I also think we underestimated the Ukrainian will and capability to fight, going in the other direction. So if we overestimated the Iraqis and Afghans, I think we underestimated the Ukrainians. And by the way, so did Vladimir Putin, who believed that the Russians would waltz in and be greeted with flowers and sweets in Kyiv because Ukraine wasn't a real country, and Ukraine certainly proved them wrong. So I think we don't focus on our partners nearly as much, and we also have difficulties with some of these intangibles. On the Hamas issue, I suspect there will be lots of postmortems on this, given that this is the most shocking security event in Israel in 50 years. I think that, I suspect it's not going to be seen as a colossal U.S. intelligence failure because, frankly, we don't focus all that much on Hamas, except indirectly as we pick up reflections from the Iranians and others. But I think, the Israelis, it'll question how reliant they can be on whatever human networks they have, and I have no insight into that. And clearly, the adversary, there's the old adage, the enemy gets a vote. There were clearly Hamas did things, perhaps with some coaching from the outside, to conduct their activities in ways that would not be as detectable by whatever human or technical means the Israelis had. Hide things in plain sight in what looked like exercises, which turned out to be something else, using techniques which were different. I think even in the military domain, at least the initial reporting suggests some of the ways in which they used their rockets, for example, were more complicated for the Iron Dome system to deal with than was previously used. So I think the adversary learns too. And so they adapted. But precisely where the intelligence failure was, I suspect, will be the matter of investigation and inquiries in Israel for a long, long time.
Great. Thank you very much. The floor is open. Please raise your hands and then identify yourself as I call on you. Yes, the gentleman right there in the white shirt and the tie.
With German television, since we are at the Israel issue at this point, The question is, why is the United States relocating a carrier group to the Eastern Mediterranean? You certainly don't need a whole carrier group to fight Hamas. Does that mean there is a serious danger of this conflict widening? And of course, Iran is the first address of this concern.
Yeah, I mean, again, I'm not privy to those deliberations anymore. But my read, purely from the outside, was this is a deterrence message mostly directed at Lebanese Hezbollah and Iran. That, there's some reporting about Iranian involvement in the planning. U.S. officials and Israeli officials have not confirmed that Iran was involved. But whether or not Iran was directly involved in planning the operation out of Gaza that started on Saturday, there is certainly a concern that if the conflict widens in the south, if it becomes a protracted conflict, if the Israelis engage in a large-scale ground incursion for a significant period of time, there would be the concern that Hezbollah might intervene in the conflict either out of solidarity with Hamas or being nudged by Tehran or out of a sense of opportunism that as the Israeli defense forces are distracted in the south, now there's a chance. So I think, you've seen rhetoric coming out of the White House saying that we're watching other potential adversaries very closely for any sign of opportunism, and I would interpret the carrier movement in that context.
Great.
Can I jump in with one from Zoom? A special
Please
question
go
from
right
Zoom?
ahead.
Who is
Apologies.
this Zoom you speak of? No, right.
Well, our Academy President, Dan Benjamin, couldn't be kept away by illness, so he's joining us in spirit, also known as Zoom. And here comes a question from him. Colin, great talk. Sorry I couldn't be there. A bit of a different question. National security experts from left to right, from Susan Rice to Bob Gates, have suggested that the greatest threat we face is not China or Russia or anyone else, but our division at home. In light of the possibility of a dysfunctional House of Representatives for the next 15 months, that seems right. Do you agree, and do you have any experiences that would illustrate this? P.S. Glad I invited you.
This will be a short answer. I think all the people that Dan cited, and I also take from the sense of the question that Dan himself, that's right. I mean, when I think about, I have two young kids, a 12-year-old daughter and an 8-year-old son, and when I think of the biggest challenges in my line of work that will impact their lives as they grow up, clearly getting the U.S.-China relationship right will matter. It'll have huge consequences for the world, just like the two leading powers in any international system have consequences. We have to get that right. Climate change, prior to moving to D.C., we were in the Bay Area, and my kids didn't have snow days, but they had smoke days all the time because of the wildfires burning far, far away. And so climate change will literally determine whether the planet they grew up on is habitable or not. But none of that will matter if we can't figure out our own stuff at home, because the United States will tear each other apart, and we'll be paralyzed by our own tribalism, polarization, division, consumed with misinformation and disinformation, and we will be incapable of tackling any of these challenges. So it's not a sufficient condition to get our democracy right, but it is a necessary condition for getting our democracy right. And I think that's true, not just in the United States, but I think the world requires a barely functioning United States of America in one way or another to do a lot of things. So I think Dan and all the folks that he cited are exactly right.
Right. I think I can do two more questions. Is that right? Okay. Let me see. I'm sorry. There's in the far back, way back there. Is that Sarah? I can't see. Okay. Could you wait for the microphone? Thank you.
Thanks for these terrific remarks. So my question is about your views on accountability for atrocity crimes as part of a defense or security strategy. So the background to my question is twofold. One is that during discussions about U.S. support for International Criminal Court investigations in Ukraine, the argument was put forward that we should be using the court as an instrument of lawfare against Russia in particular. A second piece of background is the National Defense Authorization Act, which included a provision on a new intelligence coordinator to gather and administer intelligence gathering on atrocities committed by China. So that was a very specific and targeted way of using atrocity accountability as part of a national defense or security strategy. And I'm curious what you think about whether we should be doing this more broadly or if this is just sort of posturing that doesn't really have any sort of tangible or important outcome in the security or defense strategies of our country. Thanks.
It's a good question, Sarah. Thanks for asking it. Look, I think it should go without question that Russia needs to be held accountable for the war crimes and atrocities they've committed in Ukraine, the wanton targeting of civilian, the kidnapping of thousands and thousands of Ukrainian children, the atrocities that have been committed throughout Ukraine. It's something that the individuals who engaged in that behavior, but the leadership that directed that behavior also needs to be held accountable. So I'm supportive of that across the board. The ICC is one venue for that. It need not be the only venue for that. You would know more about this than me. There has been debate in Washington, in the administration, and elsewhere about how forward-leaning to be in supporting the ICC. I personally am supportive of the United States at least providing indirect aid to the ICC in its investigation, declassifying certain materials and other things that we may have at our disposal, helping point the investigators in certain areas. I understand the anxiety that some had within the administration, to include at the Pentagon, that because the United States is not a party to the Rome Treaty, which created the ICC, that in using that against Russia, also not a state's party to the treaty, that it might generate some vulnerabilities for the United States down the road. Although I think enough mitigations have been put in place to make it so that that's not the case. So I'm largely supportive of us, cooperating to the degree that we can, to help hold Russia accountable. Although again, I understand those who've had concerns that it might increase the vulnerability of our service members, and that's why I think it was good that we took our time in making that decision so that we could mitigate those concerns.
Great, thank you. This may be the last question. The gentleman in the white shirt, Anna will give us the schedule as to what happens. Thank you. Could you identify yourself, please?
Torsten Benner with the Global Public Policy Institute. Thanks a lot for a great talk, Colin. I'd like to ask a question on deterrence. First, what's your lesson on the failure of deterrence vis-a-vis Vladimir Putin to start a war that we knew he was planning? And second of all, integrated deterrence for the pacing scenario, Taiwan. Can you spell out your approach to the nuclear dimension? You mentioned China relying on the long shadow of the nuclear umbrella and maybe threatening. And how do we come in as European allies in the deterrence equation on that pacing scenario? Do we have a role to play? And finally, just quickly, I was struck that you didn't use the whole one theater, Russia and China together. You discussed it separately, but how would you view that also in the context of a Taiwan scenario?
Great. Those are really important questions. I think, I think historians, political scientists, and journalists will be debating for decades why Putin wasn't deterred, or even if he was deterrable. So there's two different hypotheses, right? One is he wasn't deterrable, and therefore deterrence failed, but nothing would have worked. The other was that he was deterrable, but not enough was done to deter him. I think a couple of things were true in the summer and fall of 2021 when Putin was putting the pieces in place for this. First, I think that he thought that the window for taking action on Ukraine was gradually closing over time. It wasn't going to snap shut in 2021 or 2022, but we saw Ukraine drifting into the EU's orbit, into NATO's orbit, and even if it didn't become a formal member, that NATO would essentially use Ukraine as a lily pad for activities against Russia. But he also saw a window closing for his imperial ambitions to reclaim Ukraine as part of a historic Russian empire. But neither one of those things were going to happen in 2021 or 2022. So what explains the timing? I think in part, he looked out and he saw a degree of opportunity. I think that, he may have seen coming out of the Trump years, coming out of Afghanistan, may have seen the
NATO alliance a little wobbly. I think that he, I think even more importantly, saw a change of government in Germany coming and maybe questioned whether Germany could have the leadership role in Europe that was exercised under Chancellor Merkel. I think that Germany has shown that it can, but I think the question was an open one in the summer and fall of 2021. I think he saw presidential elections coming in France, and may have questioned how that would play into France's willingness to stand up to Russia if it were to do this. And he saw winter coming with high oil prices, and energy dependence in Europe, and may have calculated that whatever bluster was coming out of Washington and Brussels, really, when it came to it, the types of sanctions we were threatening would not be imposed. Because after 2014, there were significant sanctions, but there were many things that were not contemplated, precisely because the economies of the West could not agree. So I think he may have looked and thought that it didn't matter what the words were, that the costs were not going to be there. I think he also serially underestimated the Ukrainians and how much fight the Ukrainians would put up and how much costs they would impose on the Russian military. I mean, I don't know what the current estimate is, but I suspect that that the Russians have suffered in a year and a half north of 300,000 casualties. That's not all killed in action. That's a combination of killed and wounded, but that's more than they suffered in Afghanistan and the two Chechen wars put together in a year and a half. I think if he had known the economic pile of bricks that fell on him and how hard the Ukrainians would have fought and how much the cost would be on the Russian military, even without U.S. or NATO intervention, I think he might have thought twice. But it was hard to convince him of any of those things because it would have required him to overcome a bunch of assumptions he had about the West and about the Ukrainians. So I'm of the view that he might have, in theory, been deterrable, but it was hard to see how the conditions could have been met that would have overcome his presumptions about the Ukrainians and about the West. That said, I think it's only half right that deterrence has failed as it relates to Ukraine, because, of course, President Biden was pretty clear that we would defend every inch of NATO, but we weren't going to fight World War III over Ukraine. And people could debate whether that was the right line to draw or not. I was supportive of drawing that line, but others can disagree. Deterrence has absolutely worked as it relates to NATO, 100%. Everybody talks about Russia's nuclear arsenal somehow having a deterrent value against U.S. or NATO intervention in the conflict, and folks can see that. But it's also the case that Russia knows precisely where all the weapons are coming in from various neighboring countries and chooses not to attack those countries because our deterrent is also alive and well. And in fact, I would argue that NATO's conventional deterrent is better vis-a-vis Russia than at any time since the 1990s, simply because of how attrited the Russian military has become. I think the question moving forward is how other countries learn from Putin's miscalculation. Because it was a miscalculation, right? He didn't believe us. We did exactly what we said. We made a threat. We thought it was credible. He didn't think it was credible. We executed it. He's now experienced it. So if you're in Beijing, what do you learn from this? And I think there you learn that turns out war in real life is hard. That you can look like the second best military in the world on paper and you won't necessarily be able to operate like that. That was certainly the case for the Russians. You can learn that the U.S. intelligence is pretty good about your plans and the ability to anticipate your next moves. You can learn that it turns out the advanced economies and liberal democracy of the world are more willing to absorb economic pain to stand up for the rules-based international order than Putin presumed. And if they were willing to do that in Ukraine, would the same happen in a Taiwan contingency? And you can learn that even in the absence of immediate large-scale direct intervention, a smaller, plucky, resilient, democratic target can actually be quite prickly and very difficult to absorb. And my own view is that if you're sitting in Beijing and your assumption is that you can defeat Taiwan in a week or two, the nightmare scenario is that that conflict goes a year or two because of the implications for the legitimacy of the CCP and of the regime, and also for the Chinese economy, because of how central Taiwan's economy is to China's economy, especially the production of microelectronics in Taiwan. And that brings me to what Europe can do. Look, I think it is not necessary for Europe to signal that they would directly militarily intervene in the Taiwan Strait contingency. What it is necessary is to signal to Beijing that Europe has stake in peace and stability across the Taiwan Strait, just like the advanced liberal democracies of the Indo-Pacific showed they had stake in what happened in Ukraine when Japan showed up and the ROK showed up and Australia showed up. The same needs to be true in the other direction. And Europe does have stake. All of us presume that the West would care very much if Saudi Arabia were suddenly threatened with being completely conquered and destroyed because of the role that Saudi Arabia plays in the global economy because of oil. Taiwan's role in the global economy is just as important because of those microchips coming out of TSMC. All right, 70% of advanced microchips, 90% of the most advanced microchips. If there was a prolonged blockade or war or the destruction of those foundries, it would devastate the world economy, to include Europe's economy. Nothing that we saw coming out of the Russia-Ukraine conflict for the world's economy would be similar. So Europe needs to communicate they have a vested interest in peace across the strait, and in no uncertain terms, make sure that Beijing understands that if Beijing tries to overturn the rules-based international order in the way that Putin did, they will face similar costs. And I think that if they send that message, and other advanced economies and liberal democracies send the same message, that the leadership in Beijing will think twice.
I can do one more or not? A quick question and a quick answer. Let's go over to the left side, right there, the gentleman right there.
I was going to talk about scope because you said a lot about the increasing scope.
Could you identify yourself, please?
Oh, my name is Oliver Pollix. I'm not with any institution. But
you're not a member of any club that would have you, or what, I don't know what the saying.
I'm still looking for one. Maybe you come to me after that. I was going to talk about scope, and you maybe a little bit proudly said how much the U.S. is able to spend in military investments. And in many regards, I think that's a rather troubling dynamic, right? Because what we want to have is a peaceful world, to be honest, where the U.S. does not need to spend so much money in military spending, equipment. Thank you. Yes, right. And I wanted to ask, what is the U.S.'s most promising strategy against that? And probably now you will say diplomacy, right? And I agree. I think that's very important. But I think we all know that, right? And we tried that the past years. And the question is, what now? Like, what changes do we need to make? And what is the most promising solutions looking forward? Is it just a continue so and maybe a little bit harder, continue more effort? Or how do we change the approach?
You've got 2 minutes to solve the problems of global order.
Look, in my remarks, I talked about this concept in the National Defense Strategy called integrated deterrence, and I made the argument that the military instrument has to sit side by side with the other instruments to be viable. I think the same is true in reverse. And I do not think that we invest enough in our diplomatic and economic instruments. The reality is, in my country, like in a lot of countries, it's easier to get money for the military than it is for other aspects and instruments. But that's also not an argument that we would be safer if we spent less on our military. We need to do both. And I think one of the things the administration has tried to do is it has spent an extraordinary amount of money in some bipartisan vehicles and some not bipartisan vehicles to invest in the underlying economic strength of the United States, the infrastructure bill, the Chips and Science Act, the IRA, in ways that will be, I think, very positive and transformative for the globe, especially on the climate front with the IRA. But we need to continue to invest in that. And my experience is diplomacy should always be your tool of first resort, and it needs to be backed up with both positive and negative economic incentives. But that if you don't have a credible military instrument in the back, there are certain things that adversaries will be willing to take extraordinary risks to pursue in ways that could be quite dangerous for the world. I think we're seeing a version of that play out in Ukraine. Again, if it happened across the Taiwan Strait, or vis-a-vis a U.S. treaty ally in the South China Sea or something like that, I think the consequences for the world will be very significant. And China very much looks at the military balance alongside all these other things. So we have to be able to invest in both. But where I would conclude is by saying, but the United States can't do this alone. I mean, a big part of this has to be our solidarity with other world democracies. I think the president does believe that there is such a thing as the free world that at its inner core means maintaining the health of the U.S. democracy, and we've talked about that a little bit. One ring out is our treaty allies in Europe and in the Indo-Pacific. One layer out are our democratic partners like India, and one layer out are countries that maybe aren't democracies, but nevertheless have a stake in a free and open international system. So think of Vietnam, where Biden recently visited, Singapore, or other countries like that. That is our team. And we cannot succeed in upholding a rules-based international order if we don't bring that team. So shame on us if we don't invest in those allies and alliances and partnerships. Shame on us if we don't provide an affirmative vision that builds a large coalition. And shame on us if a year from now we turn away from those allies and partnerships, because I will tell you, it will make America less safe. It will make the world less safe.
With all of that, I'd like you to join me in thanking Colin for a really wonderful presentation.